Liver-eating outlaw. Hidden files and DNA evidences exposed. What if the most feared man of the Wild West wasn't who history says he was? John Liver-eating Johnston, soldier, outlaw mountain man, and lawman, was said to have hunted the Crow Nation for years, eating the livers of those he killed. What if the man behind the myth was running from his past, hiding under a false name, and living a double life no one ever fully uncovered? His death only deepened the mystery. His body vanished, reappeared decades later, and may not even rest where his monument stands today. In this series, we'll separate legend from fact. We'll uncover the truth behind the Crow vendetta, the missing decade, and the modern DNA debate that could rewrite the story of the West's most terrifying name. Stay with us. The real man behind the myth. How did a quiet soldier from New Jersey become the blood-soaked legend known as Liver-eating Johnston? For more than a century, Americans have repeated his story. A mountain man who avenged his murdered wife by hunting Crow warriors and eating their livers. It sounds like a campfire tale, part horror and part hero myth. But what if that story, so deeply carved into Western folklore, hides a very different truth? What if John Johnston wasn't a monster or even a vengeful warrior, but a man, caught between myth and survival? The records of his early life are surprisingly ordinary. He was born John Garrison around 1824 in Little York, New Jersey, to a farming family of modest means. There was no sign in his youth of the killer he would later become in legend. Like many young men of the time, he sought adventure out west after serving briefly in the Navy. Somewhere along the way, his name changed from Garrison to Johnston, a shift that would mark the beginning of his transformation into something larger than life. Historians still debate why he changed it. Some say he deserted the Navy, taking a new name to hide. Others think it was simply a way to reinvent himself in a land where pasts could be erased overnight. By the early 1840s, Johnston had become a trapper and trader in the rugged frontier stretching through Montana and Wyoming. These were brutal landscapes, frozen winters, isolated cabins, and constant danger from wildlife and raids. The fur trade was collapsing, and survival depended on skill, toughness, and sometimes violence. Johnston quickly built a reputation as both a capable hunter and a man who could handle himself in a fight. His enormous size, nearly 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, earned him respect among both frontiersmen and native tribes. The central myth of Johnston's life begins with his marriage. According to the popular tale, he wed a woman from the Flathead tribe. Not long after, she was allegedly killed by Crow warriors, triggering his legendary campaign of revenge. The story claims he spent years tracking and killing Crow, cutting out their livers and consuming them as vengeance. It's the kind of story the Old West loved, bloody, simple, and heroic in its savagery. But the historical record tells a murkier story. There is no contemporary evidence that Johnston ever married a Flathead woman, or that his wife was murdered. The tale appeared only decades later, written by journalists and dime novel authors eager for sensational content. In the 1860s, Western newspapers were filled with lurid accounts of man-eaters and lone avengers. Johnston's story fit perfectly. The liver-eating detail may have originated from a misunderstanding of native ritual practices. Some tribes believed that consuming an enemy's liver granted courage or spiritual power, yet no credible account ever confirmed that Johnston practiced this himself. So how did the myth grow so large? Part of the answer lies in timing. America after the Civil War was obsessed with the frontier. The Wild West had become a symbol of renewal and raw masculinity. Newspapers and pulp novels needed larger-than-life characters, and men like Johnston, with their half-known pasts, were easy clay for myth-making. By the time writers like Vardis Fisher and Raymond Thorpe published Crow Killer in the mid-20th century, the line between fact and fiction was long erased. But Johnston's real story may be more interesting than the legend. After years in the wilderness, he began serving as a scout and guide for the U.S. military during conflicts with native tribes. Later, he worked as a lawman, first as deputy sheriff of Red Lodge, Montana, and later as town marshal in Carlson. These were not the jobs of a deranged killer. They required discipline, trust, and a sense of justice. Local newspapers from the time described Johnston as respected, even admired. One article from the Billings Gazette called him a man of quiet strength who never started a fight, but always finished one. In his later years, Johnston grew into a symbol of the fading frontier. He told tall tales freely, often exaggerating his past. He once joked to a group of soldiers that half the things they say I did would have made me too busy to sleep. Even then, he seemed aware that the myth had grown beyond his control. The old mountain man who once lived by the rifle now lived inside a story told by others. When he died in 1900 at a veteran's home in Santa Monica, California, the newspapers called him John Johnston, Indian fighter, and repeated the same myth he had spent a lifetime half feeding and half denying. His body was buried quietly in Los Angeles, far from the mountains where his story began. Yet decades later, Hollywood resurrected him. Robert Redford's 1972 film Jeremiah Johnson reimagined the old frontiersman as a tragic, solitary hero. Gentler, wounded, almost spiritual, it was a beautiful reinvention, but not the real man. Today, historians armed with digital archives and newly found letters are re-examining Johnston's life. They find no evidence of hundreds of Crow killings, no proof of cannibalism, and no military reports describing such a campaign. What they do find are traces of a man who bridged two worlds, the fading fur trade and the coming of law and settlement. He spoke several native dialects, traded fairly, and often served as a mediator in disputes. In truth, he was less a killer of the West and more its reluctant guardian. So who was the real John liver-eating Johnston? A savage avenger, a peaceful lawman, or something in between? The answer may be that he was all of them, a man who lived in a violent time, whose courage and temper made him unforgettable, and whose legend grew to fill the spaces history left blank. What he actually did may never match what people needed him to be. Later in this series, we'll dig into the second part of his story, the so-called Crow vendetta, the supposed blood feud that made him infamous, and examine whether the revenge story that defined his life was ever real at all. The Crow vendetta mystery. How did one man come to be known as the deadliest enemy the Crow Nation ever faced? According to frontier legend, John liver-eating Johnston spent years avenging the murder of his native wife by killing hundreds of Crow warriors, one at a time. He supposedly ate their livers after each killing, making him both feared and mythologized. But how much of this tale was true? When historians began tracing the story backward, they found something startling. The entire saga may have been built on exaggeration, misreporting, and the need to invent a frontier monster America could both fear and admire. The tale began to spread in the 1860s and 1870s, long after the supposed events had happened. Newspaper columns and saloon gossip told of a trapper named Johnston who waged a one-man war against the Crow. The story claimed he roamed from the Bighorn Mountains to the Yellowstone Valley, tracking and killing warriors with deadly precision. His vengeance, they said, began after Crow raiders murdered and scalped his Flathead wife. But when modern researchers began combing through census records, tribal histories, and military reports, a problem appeared. There was no record of such an attack, and no mention of a Flathead woman married to Johnston. The earliest printed version of the Crow vendetta appeared not in an eyewitness account, but in an 1890s frontier memoir, a genre notorious for embellishment. The author had never met Johnston but based his story on second-hand campfire tales. Later, 20th-century writers like Raymond Thorpe and Vardis Fisher amplified it in their 1958 book Crow Killer, which became the foundation for the legend. The book claimed Johnston killed over 300 Crow warriors during his bloody campaign. Historians today call that number impossible. Even at the height of frontier conflict, no lone man could have survived that many encounters. So where did the myth begin? One clue lies in the oral histories of the Crow themselves. In interviews recorded during the early 1900s, some tribal elders recalled a large white mountain man who was feared for his violence, but also respected for his skill. They described him as a solitary figure who traded, hunted, and occasionally fought, but not a man on a personal vendetta. One Crow elder summarized him simply: "He fought us sometimes. He traded with us sometimes. He was no devil." That version sounds more human than the vengeful killer of the dime novels. Other historians think that Crow vendetta may have grown out of Johnston's involvement in a series of broader frontier conflicts. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, numerous skirmishes occurred between trappers, miners, and various tribes across Montana and Wyoming. Johnston might have participated in some of these fights, and over time, his role expanded in the retelling. Each decade added new killings, new motives, and new horrors until he became the symbol of the entire white versus native frontier war. Even the grisly detail that gave him his name, the eating of livers, has been questioned. In native spiritual belief, the liver is a powerful organ associated with courage and strength. Consuming it was said to transfer those qualities. Some scholars think the tale of Johnston's liver eating was originally a symbolic exaggeration of his fearlessness, not an account of literal cannibalism. But once sensational writers got hold of it, the story hardened into a gruesome image that audiences couldn't resist. By the 1870s, the myth had taken on a life of its own. Newspapers in frontier towns like Helena and Virginia City reported fresh sightings of Johnston's vengeance, claiming he had ambushed entire groups of Crow hunters. One article even claimed he was invincible, that no bullet can pierce him, no knife can cut him. These reports weren't journalism, they were entertainment. Readers wanted tales of savagery, and editors were happy to sell them. The real Johnston, meanwhile, was working as a guide for military patrols and serving as deputy sheriff in Montana. The turning point came when the story reached the East. Dime novel publishers turned the mountain man into a larger-than-life antihero. In their pages, he was no longer a man. He was a spirit of vengeance, the embodiment of frontier justice. For audiences worn out by industrialization and politics, his wild freedom became romantic. It was the birth of a distinctly American archetype, the avenger who lives by his own code, unbound by law or mercy. But modern historians, using tribal archives and archaeological surveys, have found new clues that further dismantle the vendetta myth. Records from Fort Benton and Fort Union trading posts show that Johnston had friendly dealings with Crow traders during the years he was supposedly at war with them. One 1855 entry even lists him as exchanging pelts for tobacco with Crow chiefs. That evidence suggests coexistence, not carnage. So why did Johnston never deny the myth? Perhaps he understood the strange power of legend. A reputation for savagery could be useful on the frontier. It kept trouble away. He was a large man, often alone in dangerous territory, and being known as the Crow Killer gave him an invisible shield. As he grew older, he seemed to accept the nickname with weary amusement. When asked late in life about the liver-eating tales, he reportedly smiled and said, "People tell what they want to believe. Maybe that's safer than the truth." In that one remark lies the essence of his mystery. Johnston's silence allowed the legend to grow unchecked, blending fear, respect, and imagination into a story that no amount of evidence can fully erase. To this day, the Crow vendetta lives on as one of the Wild West's most enduring myths, a parable of vengeance that says more about America's need for heroes and monsters than it does about the man himself. So, did liver-eating Johnston really wage a personal war against the Crow? The evidence says no. But did he live in a time when survival often required violence, and where myth could be more powerful than truth? Absolutely. In the end, his so-called vendetta was less about revenge and more about the way stories grow in a land that needed legends. Later in this series, we'll turn to another mystery: Johnston's disappearing years, the lost decade when he vanished from all known records. What was he doing? And why did he return with a new name, new scars, and a silence he never explained? The liver-eating legend. What makes a man's name echo through history? For John Liver-Eating Johnston, it wasn't his years as a trapper, lawman, or soldier. It was a single gruesome image. A giant of the mountains cutting open his enemies and devouring their livers to avenge his murdered wife. It is one of the most chilling tales of the American frontier, but also one of its most uncertain. The story made Johnston famous long after his death. Yet the deeper we look, the more it seems to belong to folklore, not fact. How did this grisly legend begin, and why has it endured so long? The first clue lies in how few people ever claim to witness such acts. No written accounts from Johnston's lifetime mention liver-eating. The story appears only decades later, surfacing in tall tales told by trappers and miners in Montana and Wyoming. One of the earliest written references comes from an 1890 newspaper article describing a mountain man known for feasting on the livers of the slain. The piece never used Johnston's name but clearly referred to him. By then, he was already a Folk figure, half man, half myth. Historians suspect that the tale grew from a cultural misunderstanding. Among several Plains tribes, the liver symbolized bravery and strength. Consuming it was a sacred act in certain rituals, believed to absorb the enemy's courage. Yet there is no reliable record of Johnston practicing such rites, nor any evidence that white mountain men of his era did. It is possible that when native warriors spoke symbolically of taking a foe's liver, white listeners took the phrase literally, turning metaphor into myth. Still, the story fit the times. The frontier loved violent heroes. Newspapers and dime novels turned real men into monsters and saints overnight. The image of a lone mountain man avenging his wife in savage fashion sold copies and stirred imagination. The legend fit the national appetite for tales of untamed justice. America after the Civil War wanted symbols of rugged independence, figures who lived beyond law and order. Johnston's name, tied to blood and wilderness, filled that role perfectly. The liver-eating myth spread rapidly after Johnston's death in 1900. It was repeated in lectures, adventure magazines, and later in the 1958 book Crow Killer, which presented it as historical fact. That book, written by Raymond Thorpe and Robert Bunker, described Johnston killing more than 300 Crow warriors and eating their livers to keep the balance of life. The authors based their work on campfire stories and secondhand oral accounts gathered long after Johnston's time. Scholars later exposed the book as largely fictional, but by then, the damage was done. The legend had entered pop culture. Hollywood cemented it. In 1972, Jeremiah Johnson, starring Robert Redford, introduced the story to millions. The film softened the gruesome details but kept the essence of the legend. A man pushed beyond humanity by loss and violence. The movie's success made liver-eating Johnston a symbol of both vengeance and freedom. Ironically, it made him far more famous than he ever was in life. But what do we actually know about the man behind the myth? Johnston's contemporaries described him as disciplined, loyal, and even gentle among friends. He guided soldiers, traded fairly with tribes, and served as a town marshal. In all those official roles, not one report or complaint accused him of barbaric acts. He wasn't a lunatic on the run. He was a respected citizen. If he had truly committed such horrors, it is almost impossible that no record or rumor from his active years would mention it. So where did the liver-eating label really come from? One theory comes from the Crow themselves. Oral accounts recorded in the early 20th century include references to a large, red-bearded white man nicknamed the man who takes the liver. The description fits Johnston. However, in those same accounts, the phrase likely referred to a warrior's courage rather than literal cannibalism. Another possibility is that rival trappers, eager to exaggerate Johnston's toughness, started the story to intimidate others. On the frontier, a fearsome reputation could save your life. The more monstrous people thought you were, the less likely they were to cross you. Even in his later years, Johnston did little to correct the tale. He seemed to accept the nickname with amusement. When asked about it by a journalist in 1899, he reportedly laughed and said, "I reckon a man's got to be called something." That short comment, half joking, half resigned, suggests he understood that legends have their own power. Denying them only makes them grow stronger. Modern historians and anthropologists now treat the liver-eating legend as a case study in how folklore evolves. It shows how a single man can become a vessel for national myth-making. Johnston's story reflected America's fascination with vengeance, wilderness, and moral solitude. He became the embodiment of the West's contradictions, both hero and savage, civilizer and destroyer. Interestingly, scientific curiosity has followed the legend into the present. Forensic researchers examining his remains, reinterred in Cody, Wyoming, found no evidence of trauma consistent with a life of constant warfare. His bones showed signs of hard labor, but not repeated combat injuries. That finding further undermines the tale of endless killing. Yet, to this day, tourism brochures in Wyoming still refer to him as the Crow Killer, and his statue in Cody bears that title. The myth continues to sell. So, did John Johnston ever truly eat a human liver? The honest answer is that no verifiable evidence exists. Not a witness statement, not a diary, not a single documented claim from his lifetime. The story appears to have grown from cultural misinterpretation rumor, and America's need for brutal heroes. What's left is a legend so vivid it outlived the man himself. But perhaps that's the point. The power of the liver-eating tale lies not in whether it happened, but in what it represents. It's the portrait of a country obsessed with the line between civilization and savagery, and a reminder of how easily that line can blur. Later in this series, we'll explore Johnston's disappearing years, the lost decade when he vanished from all official records. Did he flee from justice, serve secretly in the military, or live under another name? The clues from that period may reveal more about the man behind the legend than any myth ever could. The disappearing years. What happened to John liver-eating Johnston during the decade when he vanished from the record, between the late 1840s and the early 1860s? The man who would later become a frontier legend simply disappears. No census data, no military reports, no trace in local archives. Then, suddenly, he reappears in Montana. Older, tougher, and already surrounded by strange stories. Those missing years have become one of the most puzzling chapters of his life. What was he doing, and why did he choose to erase that part of himself? The mystery begins around 1843. At that time, Johnston, then still calling himself John Garrison, was serving in the U.S. Navy. He was assigned to the frigate Congress, but records show that he deserted within 2 years. That act alone could have destroyed his life. Desertion from the Navy in the 1840s was a serious crime, often punished by imprisonment or even death. After that, Garrison vanishes. When he resurfaces in the West as John Johnston, he is already using a new name. Many historians believe the change was deliberate, a clean break from a past he could no longer return to. But where did he go during that time? Some researchers think he joined fur trapping expeditions along the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers under assumed identities. The American Fur Company, which operated there in the 1840s, kept only sporadic employment records. A few of those records mention a J. Johnson working in the region, a possible clue, but not proof. Others argue he may have fought as a mercenary or scout in the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. Several veterans described serving alongside a tall, red-bearded frontiersman named Johnston who claimed to be from New Jersey. Whether that was coincidence or confirmation, no one can say. What makes the gap more curious is that when Johnston does reappear in the 1850s, he is a man transformed. Witnesses describe him as disciplined, deliberate, and physically powerful. He could speak several native languages and seemed intimately familiar with both plains and Rocky Mountain terrain. Those were not the skills of a man who had spent his missing years idle. They were the marks of experience earned through hard travel, trading, and survival. So where did he learn them? Some historians have proposed a more secretive explanation. They believe Johnston may have served as a civilian scout or courier for the army during campaigns against native tribes in the late 1840s. At that time, the military often used frontiersmen as unofficial guides, paying them in cash or supplies without formal enlistment. That would explain his later familiarity with military structure and his ease around officers during his time as a lawman. However, military payroll ledgers from Fort Leavenworth and Fort Laramie, two likely posts, show no Johnston or Garrison during those years. If he worked for them, it was off the books. Then there's the more controversial theory that Johnston spent his missing decade not as a soldier or trapper, but as an outlaw. Frontier gossip collected in the early 20th century claimed he once led a small band of horse thieves operating between Wyoming and Colorado. One story said he was captured by Blackfeet warriors and escaped after killing a guard with his bare hands. Another claimed he lived briefly among the Crow themselves, trading and hunting with them. That last version adds an ironic twist. If true, it would mean Johnston may have once been allied with the very people later said to be his mortal enemies. The evidence for those claims is mixed. The outlaw theory relies mostly on hearsay. The Crow connection, however, has some support. In Crow oral tradition, there are references to a white man named Bear's Tooth, who lived among them for a season in the mid-1850s. The description, tall, bearded, and solitary, matches Johnston. Tribal historians have speculated that this period might have been when Johnston forged early relationships with the Crow, long before the so-called vendetta. If so, it completely rewrites his story, not as a tale of vengeance, but of complicated friendship and betrayal distorted by later retelling. Another piece of the puzzle may lie in his later behavior. By the 1860s, Johnston had settled near Fort Benton and was working as a guide and trader. He showed an almost obsessive caution about being photographed or having his movements documented. Friends recalled that he avoided giving details about his early life, often joking, "I've lived more than one life, and the first one wasn't worth remembering." That cryptic remark has fueled endless speculation. Was he hiding a criminal past, or a military secret? A modern theory, supported by recent archival digging, suggests Johnston's disappearance might have been tied to espionage. During the 1840s, the U.S. government quietly sent scouts into the Western territories to map potential routes and assess native alliances. Some of those scouts were civilians operating under assumed names. In 2013, a historian reviewing territorial correspondence in the National Archives found a letter mentioning a John Johnson who supplied intelligence from Crow and Blackfeet territory to a military officer in St. Louis. The timeline fits, though proof remains elusive. If true, Johnston's missing decade may have been spent in clandestine service, explaining both his later military connections and his deep knowledge of the land. No matter which theory one favors, fugitive, outlaw, or secret scout, those years changed him profoundly. When Johnston returned to public life, he seemed older than his age, quiet but commanding. He carried himself like a man who had lived many lives. The transformation from sailor to mountain man wasn't just physical. It was psychological. He had become part of the landscape itself, shaped by solitude, survival, and perhaps guilt. What makes the story of his disappearance so compelling is how little we will ever truly know. The frontier left few records, and men like Johnston often preferred it that way. They built their freedom on anonymity, yet the silence of those missing years still speaks. It tells us that somewhere between fact and legend, Johnston became the figure history now struggles to define. Later in this series, we'll follow him into his lawman years, when the feared Crow killer surprisingly became a respected sheriff and peacekeeper. It's a chapter that forces us to ask, how does a man once defined by violence learn to live under the rule of law? Johnston the lawman. How does a man known as the Crow killer become a keeper of the peace? For John liver-eating Johnston, the transformation from frontier avenger to respected lawman seems impossible. Yet that is precisely what happened. In the last decades of his life, the same man once feared as a savage killer wore a badge, kept order, and was trusted by towns that knew his name only through whispers. It is one of the most surprising reversals in Western history, and one that reveals far more about America's evolving frontier than about Johnston himself. By the late 1860s, the West was changing. The fur trade that had once sustained mountain men like Johnston was dying, and settlements were pushing deeper into the wilderness. Former trappers, outlaws, and scouts found themselves out of work. Many drifted toward law enforcement, a profession where toughness and frontier knowledge were assets. Johnston fit the mold perfectly. He was experienced, fearless, and had the quiet authority of a man used to handling danger. He first appeared in public records again around 1868, in the Montana Territory, near Fort Benton. There, he worked as a guide, hunter, and scout for Army patrols. By all accounts, he was steady, disciplined, and effective. Officers described him as a man who never wastes words and never misses his mark. His reputation spread quickly through mining camps and river towns, places often desperate for order. Within a few years, he was appointed deputy sheriff of Red Lodge, Montana, and later served as town marshal of Carlson, a rough settlement that would one day become Billings. Carlson in the 1870s was a frontier town straight from legend. Saloon fights, gambling dens, and gunfire echoing through the streets at night. Yet under Johnston's watch, it slowly calmed. He was known for walking alone through dark alleys with nothing but his revolver and his booming voice. When drunks drew their guns, he rarely fired back. He simply leveled his weapon and said, "Don't make me spoil a quiet night." Most of the time, that was enough. He carried his legend like a weapon. The idea of what he could do was stronger than any bullet. Local newspapers from the period give rare glimpses of his lawman years. The Billings Gazette described him as a man feared by none but fools. Another paper reported that Johnston settled disputes faster with his words than most could with a six-shooter. He had learned, after decades of violence, that the appearance of strength was often all the strength he needed. But beneath his calm exterior, Johnston remained a man of contradictions. Though he enforced the law, he still lived by his own code. He drank hard, gambled often, and kept company with former soldiers, trappers, and drifters, men who lived on the edges of respectability. He was respected but not entirely trusted. Townsfolk admired him but kept their distance. They sensed that under his badge still lived the ghost of the mountain man who had once survived by his own rules. The law of the frontier was personal, not procedural, and Johnston embodied that. In one account from 1878, a group of miners caught a horse thief and prepared to hang him without trial. Johnston arrived and cut the rope himself. "If the man's guilty," he said, "we'll prove it first. If he's innocent, you'll thank me later." The mob backed down. It was a striking moment, proof that the man once accused of savage vengeance now stood against mob justice. Yet his past was never far behind him. Travelers passing through Carlson often recognized his name and asked, half in jest, if he still ate the livers of his enemies. Johnston usually smiled and said, "Only if they're still warm." He understood the power of myth, and sometimes he used it. That hint of menace kept troublemakers cautious and made townspeople feel safe. Ironically, his bloody reputation became his best tool for keeping peace. By the 1880s, age had begun to wear on him. His hair grayed, his gait slowed, but his mind stayed sharp. He served briefly as a deputy U.S. Marshal, patrolling stretches of the Yellowstone River. It was dangerous, lonely work, and he took pride in it. One fellow officer recalled, "He treated his badge as he once treated his rifle, with care, and with the understanding that both could end a man's life if used wrong." Still, Johnston never fully adjusted to the modernizing West. Railroads replaced trails, telegraphs replaced messengers, and towns that once depended on his kind now sought businessmen, not gunmen. He found himself drifting again, moving from Montana to Colorado and finally to Wyoming. His health declined, likely from years of injury and exposure. In the mid-1890s, he retired to a veteran's home in Santa Monica, California, a far cry from the wilderness that had defined his youth. Even in his final years, visitors came to hear the old stories. Journalists and tourists wanted the liver eater, not the quiet old man in the chair. He gave them what they wanted, a few sharp jokes, a glint of danger in his voice, and just enough mystery to make them wonder what was true. When asked if he regretted his violent past, he reportedly answered, "Regret is for men who think they'll live twice." The image of Johnston as lawman stands as one of the most ironic transformations in frontier history. He began as a fugitive, lived as a legend, and ended as a servant of the law. It was not redemption in the traditional sense. He never renounced who he had been, but rather a slow evolution. In a land where justice had once meant revenge, he had learned to wield restraint. Modern historians see Johnston's lawman years as a symbol of the West itself growing up. The wilderness that had once celebrated vengeance was learning to value order. The man once seen as a killer became the embodiment of balance between violence and peace. He carried both with equal weight, and that duality is what makes his story so haunting. When Johnston left his post in Carlson for the last time, townspeople gathered to see him off. According to one local account, as he mounted his horse, someone shouted, "Who'll keep order now, Marshal?" Johnston smiled and replied, "You will, if I did my job right." Then he rode away, disappearing once again into the vast American landscape, leaving behind not fear, but respect. Later in this series, we'll follow him into his final chapter, the death and reburial mystery, where even his remains would travel strange paths, guarded by secrecy, controversy, and myth, much like the man himself. Death and reburial mystery. How does a man who lived surrounded by myth manage to remain mysterious even in death? John Liver Eating, Johnston's final years were quiet, but what happened after he died became one of the strangest posthumous journeys in Western history. His body was moved across states, argued over by politicians, film stars, and historians, and even now, questions linger about whether the remains buried in Wyoming truly belong to him. The death and reburial of John Johnston show that legends, unlike men, never really die, they just keep changing address. By the late 1890s, Johnston was an old man, worn down by decades of cold winters, bullet wounds, and whiskey. He had left Montana behind and settled at a soldiers' and sailors' home in Santa Monica, California. The irony wasn't lost on him. The mountain man who had once lived by his rifle now spent his days in a coastal home for veterans, surrounded by palm trees instead of pine forests. His health was failing. His hands trembled, and his legs were weak, but his voice, according to those who knew him, still carried the mountains in it. Johnston died there in 1900, reportedly of pneumonia. He was 76, though even that number is uncertain, like everything else about him. The records list him as John Johnston, Private, Company H, 1st Colorado Cavalry, confirming his Civil War service. His death was hardly noticed outside California. There were no obituaries in Montana or Wyoming, no tributes to the old lawman. He was buried quietly in the Los Angeles Soldiers Cemetery, marked by a simple headstone that read, John Johnston, Company H, 1 Colorado Cav. For more than 70 years, that grave was forgotten. His legend, meanwhile, continued to grow. Books and magazines in the early 20th century revived his Crow Killer story, turning him into a symbol of untamed frontier vengeance. By the 1950s, writers were calling for a proper monument, arguing that the greatest mountain man in American history deserved better than an unvisited grave near the Pacific Ocean. Then Hollywood stepped in. In 1972, the film Jeremiah Johnson premiered, starring Robert Redford as a character inspired by Johnston. The movie was a hit, and public interest in the real man surged. Among those inspired was Robert "Bob" Edgar, a Wyoming historian and former highway patrolman who founded Old Trail Town, a collection of authentic frontier buildings near Cody, Wyoming. Edgar launched a campaign to bring Johnston's remains home to the mountains he had loved. The idea captured the imagination of locals, and Redford himself. After months of negotiations, permission was granted to exhume the body. In June 1974, a small group traveled to Los Angeles to retrieve Johnston's remains. The crew included Edgar, several Wyoming officials, and actor Robert Redford, who quietly helped fund the reburial. They opened the grave and removed what was believed to be Johnston's coffin. The bones were placed in a bronze casket and flown to Wyoming, accompanied by a military escort and full honors. Newspapers across the country covered the event. Headlines read, "Mountain Man Comes Home." But from the moment the casket arrived, questions arose. Some historians pointed out that records from the soldiers' cemetery were incomplete. Graves had been moved and renumbered several times over the decades. It was possible, they warned, that the remains exhumed were not Johnston's at all. No DNA testing was conducted at the time. The team relied entirely on the assumption that the grave's location matched the original 1900 burial records. Even now, that identification remains uncertain. Still, on June 8, 1974, the people of Cody held a grand ceremony. Thousands gathered as Redford helped carry the casket to its new resting place in Old Trail Town. The U.S. Army provided an honor guard, and Native representatives from several tribes attended, including the Crow, who came not as enemies but as friends. A 21-gun salute echoed across the mountains. In a poetic twist, the man once said to have waged war against the Crow was finally laid to rest in their presence. Yet the mystery doesn't end there. A few weeks after the ceremony, rumors began to circulate among cemetery staff in Los Angeles. Some claimed the wrong coffin had been shipped. Others said parts of the skeleton, specifically the skull, had been missing. When contacted by reporters, officials refused to comment. Decades later, when researchers requested access to the original records, they discovered that the file on Johnston's grave had vanished. It was as if the mountain man had managed one last disappearing act. Modern forensic technology could, in theory, solve the mystery. DNA could confirm whether the remains in Cody belonged to Johnston, but there are no known living relatives to compare against. Some historians have suggested extracting trace DNA from personal items or artifacts, such as his rifle or pipe, both preserved in museums. So far, those proposals have gone nowhere. Still, the symbolism of his 1974 reburial remains powerful. The journey from forgotten veteran to honored frontier icon mirrors how America has reshaped its memory of the West. The real Johnston, a complex, aging man who once enforced law and sought peace, was replaced by the mythic mountain man who could never die. The reburial didn't just move a body, it resurrected a legend. Standing at his grave today in Cody, visitors see a bronze statue of a towering man with a rifle, staring toward the mountains. Beneath it lies a casket that may or may not hold his bones. Perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. Johnston lived between fact and fiction, and even in death, he occupies both worlds. His story refuses to be contained by history alone. Whether those remains truly belong to John, liver-eating, Johnston, or to another forgotten soldier is a question that may never be answered. What matters, perhaps, is that in bringing him home, Americans reconnected with the restless spirit of the frontier, a place where truth and myth have always shared the same ground. Later in this series, we'll explore the final unsolved mystery tied to Johnston, modern DNA theories, and ongoing investigations, as historians and forensic experts continue to ask whether the man buried in Wyoming is really who we think he is. Modern investigations and DNA questions. What if the man buried under the name Liver-Eating Johnston isn't him at all? What if, after a lifetime of half-truths and reinvention, even his final resting place is one last unsolved mystery? In recent years, historians and scientists have reopened the strange case of John Johnston's remains, asking whether modern DNA testing could finally prove his identity or expose another chapter of mistaken legend. What they've found so far only deepens the mystery. The problem begins with uncertainty. When Johnston died in 1900 at the Soldiers and Sailors Home in Santa Monica, he was buried in what was then called the Los Angeles Soldiers Cemetery. The record of his burial was brief. One handwritten line noting his name, regiment, and grave number. Over the decades, the cemetery expanded, graves were renumbered, and several burial sections were rearranged. By the time Robert Redford and historian Bob Edgar organized Johnston's reburial in 1974, those original maps were fragmentary at best. When the exhumation team arrived in Los Angeles, they relied on a paper diagram and verbal guidance from cemetery staff. According to reports, they unearthed a coffin marked with an eroded plaque that matched Johnston's supposed grave number. But that number might have been reassigned in the early 1900s when the cemetery underwent renovations. A few records from that period suggest some graves were relocated without updating names. It's possible, then, that the bones inside the coffin weren't Johnston's, but another veteran's. That small clerical uncertainty has grown into one of the strangest debates in Western history. In the years following the 1974 reburial in Cody, Wyoming, a handful of historians began questioning the accuracy of the exhumation. In 1986, a researcher named David Klepper examined surviving cemetery maps and noticed a mismatch. Johnston's listed plot number corresponded not to the grave that was opened, but to one a few rows away. He proposed that the wrong body had been taken. The discovery caused a brief stir in local papers, but quickly faded. Without scientific testing, there was no way to confirm it. That changed in the early 2000s when DNA analysis became advanced enough to identify historical remains. The idea of testing Johnston's bones resurfaced, championed by several Western historians and scientists. If DNA could be extracted and compared to genetic material from verified descendants, the question could finally be settled. But there was one immediate obstacle: no proven living relatives. Johnston's early life is still debated, and no family members have been conclusively traced from his supposed birthplace in New Jersey. His Navy records list him as John Garrison, a name so common that genealogists hit a dead end. Without a direct descendant, DNA testing would be meaningless. Still, the idea refuses to die. In 2012, a team of researchers from the University of Wyoming proposed a workaround. They suggested comparing mitochondrial DNA from the remains in Cody with samples from preserved hair or tissue associated with Johnston's known possessions: his rifle stock, pipe, or military uniform buttons. Some of these artifacts are held at the Cody Museum and Old Trail Town. However, testing them would require partial destruction of fragile materials, and curators have so far declined permission. Meanwhile, small inconsistencies in Johnston's reburial records continue to raise eyebrows. Witnesses from 1974 later admitted that parts of the skeleton appeared incomplete. One participant recalled that the skull was separate from the rest of the bones, wrapped in cloth, like someone had handled it before. Another claimed there were signs that the remains had been moved once before, perhaps during a forgotten relocation at the Los Angeles cemetery decades earlier. If true, that means even before the 1974 ceremony, Johnston's body may already have been disturbed or misidentified. Beyond the forensic mystery lies a deeper historical one. New research suggests that Johnston might not have been as solitary in his old age as once believed. Letters uncovered in 2018 from a fellow veteran named Henry Taylor describe a man named Old John, who claimed to be the Crow killer, but gave a slightly different account of his service and birthplace. If this was Johnston, it hints that even he may have encouraged confusion about his past, perhaps deliberately, if his identity was fluid. In life, it's not surprising that it remains uncertain in death. Despite the doubts, the grave in Cody has become a shrine. Each year, thousands of visitors leave coins, whiskey bottles, and miniature flags beside the bronze statue of the mountain man. For most, the question of whose bones lie beneath doesn't matter. The legend itself has become more powerful than the evidence. Yet among historians, curiosity persists, as one researcher put it. If the man in that coffin isn't Johnston, then we've buried the wrong story, and maybe we've misunderstood the real one all along. The debate over exhumation remains unresolved. Some call for DNA testing, arguing that the truth should finally be known. Others insist the dead should be left in peace, pointing out that Johnston himself thrived on mystery and likely would have preferred to keep it that way. Bob Edgar, the man who led the reburial, once said, "Whether it's him or not, he's home now." The myth fits the man, and the man fits the myth. That sentiment captures the essence of the modern dilemma. The legend of John liver-eating Johnston has outgrown the need for proof. He stands for something larger than one life, a symbol of the harsh freedom and moral ambiguity that defined the American frontier. Still, the unanswered questions around his identity tug at historians' curiosity. Was he truly the man we think he was, or a wandering sailor who built a life from fragments of borrowed names and borrowed stories? Until someone opens the grave again, we may never know. The tools of modern science can illuminate bones, but they can't measure myth. In that sense, Johnston has achieved a kind of immortality, one that no DNA test can touch. And so the story ends much as it began, with a mystery that refuses to rest. The man who once vanished from history for 10 years now lies beneath the Wyoming soil, perhaps still keeping his greatest secret. Whether it's his bones or not, the legend remains intact. And maybe, for a man who lived between truth and tale, that's exactly how he would have wanted it.